Imagine this. Before the first star ignited, before space and time themselves existed, before anything we could possibly comprehend came into being, what was there? Not darkness, because darkness implies the absence of light, and light hadn't been created yet. Not emptiness, because even emptiness is something. We're talking about a state so beyond human understanding that our language fails us entirely. Yet humanity has dared to ask one of the most audacious questions imaginable. Who was God before creation? What was the divine doing in that incomprehensible eternity before anything else existed? This question has spawned thousands of years of theological debate, mystical experiences, philosophical arguments, and even wars. It's a question that makes even the most brilliant minds humble because we're essentially asking finite beings to comprehend the infinite. But that's never stopped us before, has it? In ancient Mesopotamia, around 4,000 years ago, a Babylonian priest named Berossus wrote something extraordinary. He described a time before creation when there was only Apsu, the freshwater ocean, and Tiamat, the saltwater sea, lying together in primordial chaos. But even this wasn't truly before. These were still created entities. The question that haunted him and haunts us today pushes even deeper. What existed before the before? The ancient Egyptians had their own mind-bending answer. They spoke of Adam, the self-created God who existed in the primordial waters of none. But here's where it gets fascinating. Adam was described as being both male and female, both existent and non-existent, both everything and nothing. The Egyptian texts suggest that before creation, deity existed in a state so complete, yet so undifferentiated that it defied all categories of thought. But perhaps no tradition has wrestled with this question as intensely as the Hebrew concept of YHWH. The very name is mysterious. When Moses asked God for his name at the burning bush, the response was, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I am that I am. Not I was or I will be, but a present tense so eternal and continuous that it encompasses all time while transcending it entirely. Rabbi Isaac Luria, a 16th century Kabbalist, proposed something that sounds almost like science fiction. He suggested that before creation, God's infinite light filled all existence. But this created a problem. How could anything else exist if God's presence was everywhere? His answer was the concept of tzimtzum, divine contraction. God literally withdrew or concealed part of divine presence to create empty space where the universe could exist. Think about that for a moment. This means creation wasn't an act of making something from nothing, but rather an act of divine self-limitation. God had to become less present for us to become present at all. It's as if the universe exists in God's shadow in the spaces where deity chose to step back. Hello there, knowledge seekers. You've found Professor Archive, where we dive deep into the mysteries that have captivated human minds for millennia. Before we continue this mind-bending journey, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment, and let's see how far across the globe this ancient question reaches. And if you're finding this exploration valuable, a super thanks really helps. Keep these deep dives coming. Now, early Christianity added another layer of complexity with the doctrine of the Trinity. Here was an attempt to explain how God could be simultaneously one and three, how divine relationship could exist even in pre-creation eternity. St. Augustine spent years grappling with this, finally admitting that the concept was so beyond human comprehension that trying to understand it fully might drive someone mad. But Augustine made a brilliant observation. If God is love, as the scriptures claim, then love requires relationship. Love cannot exist in isolation. It needs an object, a beloved. This led to the revolutionary idea that the Trinity wasn't something God became for creation, but what God always was. The Father loving the Son through the Spirit in an eternal dance of perfect relationship that existed before anything else. The medieval Islamic philosopher Al-Ghazali approached this from a radically different angle. He argued that before creation, Allah existed in such perfect unity and completeness that concepts of before and after are meaningless. Time itself is a creation, so asking what God was doing before creation is like asking what's north of the North Pole. The question itself contains a category error. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. Al-Ghazali suggested that Allah's decision to create wasn't made in time. It was eternal. From our perspective, creation has a beginning, but from the divine perspective, the intention to create is as eternal as God himself. This means that in some incomprehensible way, we've always existed in God's mind, even before we existed in reality. Hindu philosophy takes this even further with the concept of Brahman, the ultimate reality that exists beyond all attributes, beyond existence and non-existence, beyond being and non-being. The Upanishads describe Brahman as Sat Chit Ananda, existence, consciousness, and bliss. But these aren't qualities that Brahman has, they're what Brahman is. Before creation, according to this view, there was no individual consciousness, no separation, no multiplicity, just pure, undifferentiated awareness. Creation isn't the making of something new, but rather the apparent division of this eternal consciousness into seemingly separate parts. It's like one dreamer dreaming of being many characters, each character believing they're separate and real. The ancient Greek philosopher Plotinus had yet another fascinating take. He described the One, a source so perfect and complete that it necessarily overflows, like a fountain that's so full it can't help but spill over. Before creation, the One existed in perfect self-sufficiency, but its very perfection meant that creation was inevitable. Not because the One needed anything, but because perfection naturally gives rise to emanation. This raises a startling possibility. What if creation wasn't a choice, but a necessity? What if the nature of ultimate reality is such that creation must happen? It's like asking why a circle is round. The roundness isn't something added to the circle, it's what makes it a circle in the first place. But perhaps the most radical idea comes from German mystic Meister Eckhart, who dared to suggest that God needs creation as much as creation needs God. He spoke of a God beyond God, the ultimate divine essence that exists even beyond the personal God who creates and acts in history. This God beyond God, Eckhart claimed, is so beyond all categories that it's neither this nor that, neither personal nor impersonal. Before creation, Eckhart suggested, even the personal God didn't exist. Only this mysterious God beyond God. The personal God we relate to is actually a manifestation that comes into being with creation. It's as if the ultimate divine reality consists of both the deepest possible transcendence and the most intimate possible immanence. And creation is what makes this paradox possible. Modern physics has added its own twist to these ancient questions. If time began with the Big Bang, then asking what happened before the Big Bang is scientifically meaningless. Some physicists, like Stephen Hawking, have suggested that the universe might be eternal in a different sense. Not because it always existed in time, but because time itself has no beginning when properly understood through quantum mechanics. Could the relationship between God and time be similar? Maybe God doesn't exist before creation in any temporal sense, but rather exists in a dimension of reality so fundamental that our concepts of before and after simply don't apply. It would be like asking what color Wednesday is. The question itself reveals our categorical confusion. The Jewish mystical text called the Zohar offers perhaps one of the most poetic descriptions of pre-creation divine reality. It speaks of the Ancient of Days, existing in such perfect concealment that even the highest angels cannot perceive anything about the divine essence. Before creation, according to the Zohar, God existed as the thought of thoughts, pure intention without object, pure consciousness without content. Creation then becomes the process by which this hidden divine reality reveals itself to itself. It's as if God creates in order to see God's own face reflected in the mirror of existence. Every star, every planet, every living being becomes a unique perspective from which the divine can experience its own infinite nature. This leads to a stunning conclusion. Maybe we're not separate from God trying to understand the divine from the outside. Maybe we're the divine trying to understand itself from the inside of its own creation. Before creation, God existed in perfect self-knowledge. Creation allows God to experience self-discovery. The early Christian theologian Origen proposed something that scandalized his contemporaries. What if creation is eternal? Not because the universe has always existed, but because God has always been creating. Perhaps what we call the creation is just one movement in an eternal symphony of divine creativity. Before this universe, other universes. Before those, still others. An eternal process of divine self-expression with no beginning and no end. But this raises an unsettling question. If God has always been creating, then what makes our creation special? Are we just one fleeting note in an eternal composition, destined to be replaced by the next movement? The answer might lie in understanding that each creation is complete and perfect in itself, while also being part of something infinitely larger. It's like asking whether a particular performance of a Bach fugue is less meaningful because Bach wrote other fugues. Each creation allows the divine to express aspects of infinite nature that could never be expressed in any other way. Sufi mystics like Ibn Arabi developed perhaps the most radical theology of all, the doctrine of Wahdat al-Wujud, or the unity of being. According to this view, there is ultimately only one reality, God, and everything else is a manifestation or self-disclosure of this one reality. Before creation, God existed as the treasure that wanted to be known. Creation is the process by which God knows God's self through infinite perspectives. This means that asking who God was before creation is like asking who you were before you looked in a mirror. You were the same person, but the mirror allows you to see yourself in a way that wouldn't otherwise be possible. Creation is God's mirror, and we are the reflections that allow divine self-recognition. The implications are staggering. If this view is correct, then the divine nature includes both perfect transcendence and perfect immanence. God is simultaneously the most distant reality, transcending all creation, and the most intimate reality, being the very essence of everything that exists. Thomas Aquinas tried to split the difference with his doctrine of divine simplicity. God, he argued, is not composed of parts. Most beings have existence, but God is existence itself. Most beings have consciousness, but God is consciousness itself. This means that before creation, God existed as pure act, pure existence, pure consciousness, with no distinction between what God is and that God is. Creation doesn't add anything to God, according to Aquinas, because God is already infinitely perfect. But creation allows this infinite perfection to be participated in by finite beings. It's like the difference between light itself and things that are illuminated by light. The light doesn't become more perfect by illuminating objects, but the illumination reveals the light's nature in new ways. But here's a mind-bending twist that few traditions dare to explore. What if the question, who was God before creation, reveals something profound about the nature of identity itself? We assume that identity persists through time, that you're the same person you were yesterday. But what if ultimate reality doesn't work that way? What if the God who exists now, in relationship with creation, is genuinely different from whatever existed before creation? Not because God changed, but because the very concept of God only becomes meaningful in relationship to creation. It would be like asking what parenthood was like before children existed. The question assumes that parenthood could exist independently of the relationship that defines it. This brings us to perhaps the most mysterious possibility of all. What if God and creation are more like dance partners than like craftsman and artifact? In a dance, neither partner exists as a complete dancer without the other. The dance only exists in the relationship between them. Could it be that God and creation co-emerge, each making the other possible? Before creation, there might not have been God as we understand the term, but rather the infinite potential for the divine creation relationship to manifest. Creation would then be the actualization of this eternal potential. Eastern Orthodox Christianity developed a concept called energies. divine activities that are genuinely God but distinct from God's unknowable essence. Before creation, according to this view, God existed as pure essence, completely beyond all relationship and activity. Creation marks the beginning of divine energies, not a change in God's nature, but the first manifestation of divine activity. This suggests a fascinating possibility. What we call God's attributes, love, wisdom, justice, mercy, might not have existed before creation, not because God lacked them, but because they only become actual in relationship with created beings. God's essence is beyond all attributes, but God's energies express this essence through interaction with creation. The Buddhist concept of sunyata, or emptiness, offers yet another perspective. Ultimate reality, according to this view, is empty of inherent existence. It has no fixed nature or essence that exists independently of relationships and conditions. This doesn't mean ultimate reality doesn't exist, but rather that its existence is purely relational. Applied to our question, this might mean that asking who God was before creation assumes a kind of substantial selfhood that ultimate reality doesn't actually possess. God might be more like a verb than a noun, not a being who acts, but pure activity itself. Before creation, this activity existed as pure potential. Creation is this potential actualizing itself in concrete relationships. As we near the end of our journey into this ultimate mystery, we should acknowledge that every tradition eventually reaches the same honest conclusion. This question pushes us beyond the limits of human comprehension. We're finite beings trying to understand infinite reality, temporal beings trying to grasp the eternal, created beings trying to fathom the nature of our Creator. But perhaps that's exactly the point. Maybe this question isn't meant to be answered in the way we answer other questions. Maybe it's designed to transform the questioner. Every serious attempt to grapple with this mystery changes us, expands our consciousness, makes us more humble and more wonder-filled. The medieval mystics had a term for this: learned ignorance. The more deeply we dive into ultimate questions, the more we realize how much we don't and can't know. But this isn't ordinary ignorance, it's an ignorance that comes from wisdom, a darkness that comes from too much light rather than too little. Could it be that the question, who was God before creation, is actually an invitation? An invitation to participate in the mystery rather than solve it, to be transformed by the question rather than satisfied by an answer? Here's what we can say with some confidence. Across cultures, across centuries, across radically different religious and philosophical traditions, human beings have consistently intuited that ultimate reality is more profound, more mysterious, and more wonderful than anything our minds can fully grasp. Whether we call it God, Brahman, the Tao, the One, or any other name, there seems to be something that transcends all our categories while somehow being intimately present in everything we experience. And this something has been generating existence, consciousness, love, beauty, and meaning for as long as anything has existed. Before creation, this mystery existed in perfect fullness, not lacking anything, not needing anything, not waiting for anything. Yet somehow, from this perfect completeness, everything else arose. Not as an accident, not as an afterthought, but as the natural expression of infinite creativity, infinite love, infinite consciousness exploring its own inexhaustible depths. We began by asking who God was before creation, and we've discovered something extraordinary. The question transforms everyone who seriously engages with it. We've journeyed through ancient wisdom traditions, medieval theology, mystical insights, and modern physics, and each perspective has revealed new depths to this ultimate mystery. Perhaps that's the real answer. The divine reality that existed before creation is the same reality that exists now, infinitely creative, endlessly mysterious, and constantly inviting us deeper into wonder. The God who was before creation is the same God who is creating still, in this moment, through the very consciousness that ponders these impossible questions. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Not because we've solved the mystery, but because we've allowed the mystery to solve us, to crack open our small certainties and reveal the infinite wonder that's been hiding in plain sight all along. The question of who God was before creation remains gloriously unanswered, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Some mysteries are meant to be lived, not solved. Some questions are doorways, not destinations. And some kinds of knowledge can only be received by those willing to admit how little they actually know. Thanks for joining this cosmic journey through one of humanity's deepest questions. If this exploration has opened your mind to new possibilities, consider supporting Professor Archive with a super thanks. It really makes a difference. What aspects of this mystery intrigue you most? Share your thoughts below, and until our next deep dive into the profound, keep questioning, keep wondering, and keep your sense of awe alive.